In the early years of our marriage, life with Clara was steady and comforting. We met at a community event, drawn together by mutual friends and a shared dream of a simple life. Quiet dinners, relaxed weekends, and a future built on love were all we ever wanted. Challenges came and went, but they never seemed unmanageable. Our 2 children gave meaning to our routines, and I believed our shared history would be enough to see us through anything. Over time, however, we became too comfortable. Conversations about dreams turned into discussions of schedules. Our time together felt less like connection and more like obligation. I ignored the subtle changes, Clara's distant stares, her colder tone. I thought they were just part of being married for so long. I was certain our bond was unshakable. But I was about to learn how fragile it really was. One evening, as I came home and found her in the kitchen, I greeted her warmly. She didn't respond, but I wasn't alarmed, I'd grown used to her silences. Later, as we settled into the bedroom, she asked me how my day went. Proudly, I shared the news of my promotion, expecting at least a flicker of excitement. Her indifference, though, was unsettling. When I asked about her day, she hesitated, then said something that stopped me cold. "Lucas, I want a divorce." I stared at her, stunned. A divorce? Why? She hesitated again, then dropped the real bombshell. "I've met someone else. We need to be together." Her words hit like a gut punch. I was used to handling surprises at work, but this was different, personal and devastating. "You've met someone? What are you saying, Clara?" I demanded, my voice trembling as I tried to process her revelation. Her voice was steady, but I could sense a hint of hesitation. "It's not like I planned this. It just happened." The words echoed in my head, but I couldn't make sense of them. I searched her face, hoping to find guilt or regret, but all she said was, "Stop looking at me like that." I must have looked lost because that's exactly how I felt. Then she said the words that ended us. "Lucas, I love him. I'm sorry. I never meant for this to happen." With that, she left the room, leaving me reeling in a whirlwind of disbelief. Nothing made sense. I should have been angry, but all I could think was, why? How? I wandered downstairs, hoping to find her and talk, but the kitchen was empty. Everything looked normal, as if she hadn't just shattered my life. Clara always prided herself on being a dedicated mother and homemaker, but now it seemed none of that mattered. I searched the house, the garage, even the yard, but she was gone. Maybe she just needed some air, I thought, trying to rationalize the situation. But as the minutes stretched into hours, anger started to creep in. I grabbed a beer and sat in the den, stewing. When I woke up, the house was still empty. I called out, but there was no answer. The silence was suffocating. That's when it hit me, she'd left. Scrambling to find my phone to call her, I heard it ringing upstairs. Her phone, wallet, credit cards, everything was still there, along with a sealed envelope. It felt as though she'd walked out of her life and left me with the scraps. Standing in our bedroom, surrounded by her things, the weight of her absence crushed me. Overwhelmed, I wandered back downstairs, unable to stay in a house filled with memories. Sleep eluded me that night, and the next morning, I dragged myself to work, going through the motions like a robot. Her words haunted me, echoing relentlessly. By the weekend, I couldn't bear staying home. I got in my car and drove, not caring where I ended up. My thoughts were a tangle of anger and longing. Did I even want to stay married to her? I didn't know. I missed the woman I'd married, not the stranger who'd betrayed me. My drive took me to a quiet bluff overlooking Silver Lake, a spot we discovered years ago while scouting retirement properties. We'd never bought the land, but it became one of our favorite places. Sitting there, watching the sunset over the water, I felt nothing but bitterness. I didn't want peace. I wanted to rage. I stepped out of the car and sat by the water, memories of happier times flooding over me. As dusk fell, I couldn't hold it in anymore. Walking back to the car, I collapsed to my knees, fists pounding the ground as I screamed into the night. Every ounce of pain and fury poured out of me until I was left hollow, exhausted. For the first time in years, I let myself cry, harder than I had even when I lost my sister. Back then, Clara had been my rock, the one who held me together. Now she was the reason I was falling apart. Alone in the darkness, I mourned the end of our marriage. I thought about all the ways I'd loved her, the big gestures, the little moments, even the arguments that never diminished my feelings for her. Her betrayal blindsided me, but I couldn't help wondering if I was partly to blame. Had I worked too much? Missed the signs? Ignored her needs? I didn't have the answers. All I knew was that the life I thought we'd built together had crumbled, and I wasn't sure I could ever rebuild. As the sun rose, my emotions began to settle, leaving behind a weary resolve. The days and weeks ahead were going to be brutal, but I told myself I'd handle it. My hands were bruised and swollen from pounding the ground, yet they didn't hurt nearly as much as my heart. I was determined to start piecing things back together. While I couldn't reach a lawyer on a Saturday, I decided to review our finances, bracing for the worst. To my surprise, Clara hadn't touched the money. It didn't fit the stories I'd heard about cheaters draining accounts. For a fleeting moment, I felt a flicker of hope, maybe this was some cruel joke or a passing mistake, and she'd come back. But then I remembered the look in her eyes when she left, detached, final. She wasn't coming back. I wondered why she had left the money untouched. Perhaps she trusted me not to retaliate, or maybe she was simply waiting for the legal process to play out. The thought of divorce still tore at me, but I knew I couldn't avoid it. My mind drifted back to the manila envelope she had left behind. Dreading what it might contain but knowing I couldn't ignore it, I forced myself to retrieve it. I grabbed the envelope from the bedroom, feeling like an intruder in my own home. Back in the kitchen, with a beer in hand, I stared at it, paralyzed by a mix of curiosity and dread. Instead of opening it right away, I turned my attention to her phone. There was nothing on it, just my missed call from Monday night. She had erased everything. I didn't know whether to laugh or cry at the thoroughness of it all. Clara had always insisted on keeping her phone bills separate, so there were no traces of her actions in the house. Her clothes were still in the closet, alongside our kids' photo albums. I couldn't understand why she had left behind things that seemed essential. Frustrated and tired, I finally opened the envelope. My name was written on it in her familiar handwriting, making it feel like a final chapter of our shared life. Inside were several documents, a petition for divorce, our marriage certificate, the kids' birth certificates, life insurance policies, and the deed to the house. There was also a smaller envelope addressed to me. I held it, dreading what it represented but needing to know. It took me 2 tries to open it, and inside was a single sheet of paper filled with Clara's handwriting. I took a long swig of my beer before reading her letter. Dear Lucas, I don't know when you'll find this, but by now, you know I've left you for someone else. This wasn't something I planned, and I'm deeply sorry for the pain I've caused. You always trusted me, never suspecting I was capable of this. That trust only made my guilt worse. You've been an amazing husband and father, and I know this is devastating. I won't go into details that might make it harder, but I met this person by accident, and what started as friendship turned into something more. This isn't about you. You've been everything a woman could want, but I couldn't fight my feelings anymore, and neither could he. He's also married and has left his spouse and kids to be with me. If it helps, we haven't crossed certain lines. We decided not to sleep together until we're both divorced. We didn't want to cause more harm by complicating things further. I've left everything behind to start fresh, and dragging this out in court wouldn't help anyone. I'm not asking for anything. You've worked hard for what we have, and I don't want to take that from you. By the time you read this, I'll have spoken to our kids. They didn't know anything, so please don't hold them accountable. I'm not asking for forgiveness, I know I don't deserve it, but I hope the kids can forgive me someday. I would like to stay in touch with them, though I'll leave that decision up to them. Leaving you wasn't easy. I'm throwing away 22 years with a loving man, and I feel the weight of my betrayal deeply. There were times I thought about telling you, hoping you could stop me, but it's too late now. My feelings have taken over, and I can't change that. I wish you a long and happy life, however you may find it. Please don't try to contact me. We'll be overseas until the divorces are finalized. I've left the name of an attorney, Jack Belgium, who has power of attorney to handle everything. All you need to do is sign the papers. Please don't fight this, it will only prolong the pain. I'll return once the divorce is finalized, but we won't see each other again. I haven't named him to avoid creating more problems. If we ever meet again, I hope it's as friends, but that's your choice. I still love you, Lucas, and I always will. Clara. As I read her words, my vision blurred with tears. I had promised myself I wouldn't cry anymore, but her letter reopened wounds I thought I had managed to close. It left me feeling hollow, too drained and shocked to process anything beyond a profound emptiness. I put everything back in the envelope and left it on the kitchen table, staring at it as if it might provide answers. I knew I needed legal advice, and it was a relief to know someone else could shoulder part of this burden. Clara had avoided sharing too many details, but I was skilled at reading between the lines. I knew I'd reread her letter, dissecting it for what she hadn't said. That weekend dragged on in an unbearable haze. Her claim that she hadn't slept with him offered little comfort, and I found myself purging the house of certain reminders. It wasn't much, but it gave me a shred of control in the face of a life I no longer recognized. That now felt completely out of my hands. I moved the bedroom furniture to the garage and carefully boxed up Clara's clothes. It was one of the hardest things I'd ever done. Every item carried her scent, bringing a flood of memories with each piece I folded. The task felt like a punishment, but I pushed through, knowing it was better to rip the bandage off than let the pain slowly eat at me. When I was done, the bedroom looked hollow, stripped of her presence. Yet strangely, I felt a tiny sliver of relief, like I had reclaimed a piece of my life. The rest of the week dragged on with a similar rhythm, one painful step after another. My attorney, however, seemed oddly upbeat, pleased with the simplicity of the settlement Clara proposed. She wasn't asking for anything, not even alimony. I should have been grateful, but the ease of it all only deepened the wound. It felt like she was erasing me from her life as efficiently as she'd erased the data on her phone. Despite my pain, my curiosity about the man she left with grew stronger. He had to be wealthy, that much was clear. Clara didn't take any money or possessions with her, confident she could start fresh with his resources. He was likely well connected too, given how thoroughly they'd vanished overseas. Her decision to leave her driver's license and other identification behind told me she had no plans to return, at least not until the divorce was finalized. Clara had covered her tracks so well that I suspected she'd had professional help. Yet according to my neighbors, there hadn't been anything unusual at the house. They did, however, mention that Clara left around 11:30 a.m. each day for the past few weeks. That was my first real clue. Whoever this man was, he had a family of his own, a wife and young children. That, coupled with his wealth, gave me a starting point. The rich are easier to trace than they think. I spent hours researching wealthy men in the state who fit the profile, in their late 30s or early 40s, with wives and families, and the resources to whisk someone away overseas. I narrowed the list to a few possibilities, but finding the exact one would be tricky. The next step was figuring out which wife on my list was suddenly missing a husband. The thought of contacting these women and explaining why I needed to know felt invasive, but it also seemed like the right thing to do. I wasn't seeking revenge, I just wanted answers. It sounds simple in theory, but in practice, it was frustrating. Most of the men on my list traveled frequently for business, often spending weeks abroad. That made it harder to pinpoint who had truly left for good. If Clara's lover had briefly returned home before disappearing again, identifying him would be almost impossible. But I kept digging, convinced the truth was within reach. In my mind, I struggled to believe that Clara and her lover could keep things platonic during a long overseas trip. Even with the best intentions, feelings as intense as theirs wouldn't stay bottled up forever. A glance, a touch, something would inevitably happen. They had time, opportunity, and no one to stop them. It felt like only a matter of time before their connection crossed every line. As I continued my search, I also turned my attention back to the house. I decided to repaint and recarpet the master bedroom, stripping away anything that reminded me of Clara. I bought new furniture and slowly started redecorating, making the space feel like mine again. I wasn't in a rush to move back in, I wanted the room to feel completely transformed first. It's strange how your perspective changes. When my marriage was strong, the bedroom was just a place to sleep or occasionally make love. Now it felt heavy, oppressive, like it carried the weight of everything that had gone wrong. The makeover wasn't just about aesthetics, it was about reclaiming my peace of mind. I spoke to my daughters a few times during this period, but our conversations left me more drained than comforted. Clara had told them even less than she'd written to me, leaving them with more questions than answers. Some of their questions were awkward and difficult, and I hated not having answers for them. I could sense their unspoken blame, as if they believed I had driven their mother away. They never said it outright, but every time we talked, the tension was palpable. Thankfully, both of my daughters lived out of state. My eldest had recently married, and while I wasn't a fan of her husband, he treated her well enough. My youngest was finishing college and set to graduate next year. If they'd been closer, I knew they would have been constantly on my case, pressing for details about the split. I couldn't have handled that, I was barely keeping my head above water as it was. At work, I slowly began to find my footing again. My boss, Herbert McNair, noticed my earlier erratic behavior and pulled me aside one day. While he expressed concern for my well-being, I knew his real worry was whether I could still perform. I assured him I was fine, and that was the end of it. Some coworkers gave me curious looks, probably wondering what had happened to make me so withdrawn. I had never been one to share much about my personal life, but I'd always been approachable at work. Now, I could feel the whispers around me. Nobody asked directly, but the tension was there. Some of the women at the office seemed to offer a little more attention, smiling, striking up small talk, but I couldn't tell if it was genuine interest or just sympathy. I wasn't ready for anything new, but I found myself noticing women in a way I hadn't for years. If someone gave me a lingering glance or smiled a little too long, I usually avoided the situation altogether. After 2 decades with Clara, I'd never needed to navigate signals like this, and now I felt completely out of my depth. To manage the growing pressure inside me, I threw myself into exercise. I had always dabbled in fitness to stay in shape, but now it became a ritual. Each morning, I started with a long run, followed by a workout that left me completely drained. The physical strain became a release, burning off the anger and frustration that constantly threatened to overwhelm me. It didn't fix everything, but it gave me a small sense of control in a world that felt like it was falling apart. Evenings were the hardest, so I decided to take up cooking. I scoured the internet for recipes and threw myself into experimenting with meals. Chopping vegetables, stirring sauces, it became surprisingly therapeutic. My culinary skills improved, and so did my diet. With time, I started looking forward to the quiet rhythm of preparing meals. My weekdays settled into a predictable routine, cooking, cleaning, tinkering with the house, working on my personal project to uncover Clara's lover, and then finally collapsing into bed. The monotony brought me a strange sense of comfort. Aside from the occasional phone call from family or friends, my life had become quiet and uneventful. After the chaos of Clara's departure, that quiet felt like a reprieve. Weekends were a different story. The empty hours stretched endlessly, forcing me to confront the loneliness that gnawed at me. I remembered something my mother used to say, idle hands are the devil's workshop. So, I turned my attention to the house, starting with the master bedroom. I'd never been much of a handyman. Clara usually called professionals for anything that needed fixing, but I decided it was time to learn. My first attempts were laughably bad. I spilled paint, bent nails, and ruined a perfectly good light fixture. But I kept at it, and gradually, I improved. Fixing things around the house gave me a small, steady sense of accomplishment in a life that otherwise felt broken. As I focused on repairing the house, I also began to notice a shift in myself. Instead of numbing my pain with alcohol, I kept busy. Whether it was sanding down furniture or piecing together the identity of Clara's lover, my projects distracted me from the ache inside. By the 4th month, I had a revelation: I hated my job. Sales demanded an endless drive to succeed, and for over 20 years, my motivation had been building a secure life for my family. With that gone, the work felt hollow. I thought about quitting. I had enough saved to retire early, though it would mean cutting back on expenses. The idea of finally chasing long-forgotten dreams crossed my mind, writing a book, creating something meaningful, but those ambitions felt too far away. Instead, I toyed with starting a small business, though I wasn't sure what it would look like yet. My attorney continued to press me about signing the divorce papers. He reminded me that the settlement heavily favored me, but I couldn't bring myself to let go just yet. I wanted answers, needed them, before I could close this chapter of my life. My daughters, meanwhile, were losing patience. They didn't want their parents to divorce, but they were beginning to accept that it was inevitable. I could hear their frustration during our calls, though it was more rooted in their pain than anything I'd done. Through it all, I hadn't heard from Clara. Not directly, and not through the kids. Her attorney, Jack Belgium, handled everything, and my own lawyer had no luck tracking her down. The silence only deepened my resolve to find the truth. At one point, my attorney suggested filing an alienation of affection claim, a move that could place blame on Clara's lover, but warned that it was risky and largely up to the court's discretion. The idea of dragging things out appealed to me in some ways, but I knew it wasn't practical. Still, I couldn't bring myself to sign the papers, no matter how much my lawyer pushed. "Just sign," he'd say. "You'll walk away with everything." But I wasn't ready to walk away, not yet. By the 6th month, my dissatisfaction with work had reached its peak. I stayed for the paycheck, knowing I might need it if legal battles loomed ahead. To supplement my income, I began day trading small amounts. I lost more than I made at first, but with time, I started turning small profits. It wasn't much, but it gave me something to focus on. I also took a friend's advice and signed up for karate classes. At first, it felt like a way to fill time, but soon I found myself going 6 days a week. The discipline and physical exertion gave me a balance I hadn't felt in years. Here's the continuation using the changed names with some subtle rephrasing for clarity and flow. I wasn't aiming for a black belt or any particular milestone, I just enjoyed the discipline and the confidence that came with learning self-defense. My routine shifted to include gym workouts in the mornings and karate in the evenings, and I found myself getting into the best shape of my life. On sleepless nights, I practiced my moves for 15 or 20 minutes, which helped calm my restless mind. Around this time, I rekindled an old interest in firearms. As a paratrooper in the army, I had been trained to shoot, but after marrying Clara and having kids, I sold my weapons to focus on family life. Now, with no one to object, I bought a firearm and obtained a concealed carry permit. This decision came after something unsettling happened. About 2 weeks after Clara left, I started noticing small things out of place in the house. At first, it seemed trivial, my keys on the rack in a different order, a book on my nightstand moved, or a bookmark sticking out slightly less than usual. I dismissed it as paranoia, but the feeling that someone had been in my home gnawed at me. To ease my mind, I changed the locks, installed a top-of-the-line alarm system, and set up cameras. I even took home protection courses through the NRA. Living alone after so many years was disorienting, and I knew I might be overreacting, but I didn't want to take any chances. Through all this, I kept questioning my feelings for Clara. Did I still love her, or was I just holding on to a memory of what we used to have? Love fades without nurturing, and I knew I'd have to confront that if I ever saw her again. But I also wondered why I couldn't just accept the divorce and move on. The terms were in my favor. Was it my ego refusing to let go? These thoughts didn't bring me comfort, so I buried them beneath my routine. I wasn't entirely alone, though. Word of my separation spread at work, and I caught the interest of a few female coworkers. As I got into better shape, the attention only increased. I went on a few dates, but nothing worked out. My mind was too preoccupied with Clara and the unanswered questions she'd left behind. The women I went out with quickly realized I wasn't ready for anything serious. Most of them could see after one date that I was too consumed with my search for closure to be fully present. While I appreciated their understanding, it left me feeling more isolated than ever. My search for Clara had stalled. Despite narrowing down my list of suspects, none fully matched the criteria. It was frustrating, but I wasn't ready to give up. I shifted my focus, trying to figure out where Clara might have met her lover. Using a map, the internet, and an old phone book, I catalogued every mall, coffee shop, and public space within a 30-minute drive from our house. The sheer number of options was overwhelming, and for a brief moment, I doubted whether this approach would lead anywhere. But then I thought, what else do I have to do? I wasn't a detective, but it made sense to start asking questions. Armed with a recent photo of Clara and printouts of my 3 suspects, I began my search. Each day during my lunch break, I spent an hour or 2 visiting various locations, following pre-planned routes to maximize efficiency. I managed to check 3 spots daily, avoiding weekends since Clara and I had often spent Saturdays together. The work was tedious, and by the 3rd week, I was starting to lose hope. Then, finally, I got a lead. At a small cafe and bar on a Friday afternoon, a female server hesitated when I showed her Clara's photo. After some gentle persuasion, and slipping her a little cash, she admitted she recognized my wife. The server hadn't seen the men in my printouts but described another man she'd often seen with Clara. He had a gray beard, neatly trimmed, salt and pepper hair, and glasses. I didn't recognize the description, but she confirmed they had been there together multiple times. I left the cafe feeling elated. For the first time in months, I had a real lead. My mood soared, and even my coworkers noticed. That same day, I closed a tough deal, earning praise and a bonus from my boss. Despite everything, I felt positive for the first time in a long while. Using the server's description, I created a composite sketch of the man. The result looked like someone who might work at a university, a studious, intellectual type. I scoured the internet, but I couldn't find a match. Weeks passed, and I was on the verge of giving up again. One day, while casually flipping through the sketch during lunch at work, a coworker, Carlos Lopez, stopped by my desk. He glanced at the drawing and paused. To my surprise, he recognized the man, saying he was a regular donor to a charity our company supported. Carlos couldn't recall the name immediately, but after some thought, he remembered, Victor Carter. Hearing that name was like a jolt of electricity. Sometimes, the smallest details make the biggest difference, and having a name felt like a breakthrough. Still, Carlos's reaction made me cautious about investigating further at work. That evening, I sat alone in my living room, holding on to the name Victor Carter like it was a lifeline. I dove into research from the privacy of my own home. By now, the house, despite the memories it held, felt like mine again. It had become a refuge where I could focus without distractions. A quick search revealed that Victor Carter was no ordinary man. He was a dot-com billionaire from the 1990s who had diversified his wealth into industries ranging from airlines to weapons research. Victor had a much younger wife, Sophia Lindgren, and 2 children. Sophia was stunning, with the kind of beauty that turned heads. While Clara was attractive, she wasn't in Sophia's league. Why would someone like Victor, who could have anyone, be interested in my wife? The thought left me confused and deflated. For days, I tried to make sense of it. My initial excitement at finding a name faded into frustration. What was I supposed to do now? Victor wasn't just a millionaire, he was a billionaire, a man with endless resources and security at his fingertips. Contacting his wife, Sophia, seemed impossible. I couldn't help but wonder what kind of mess Clara had dragged us into. The rest of the week passed in a fog of uncertainty and apprehension. My subconscious seemed to resist the idea of digging deeper, as if I were afraid of what I might uncover. Still, the internet offered endless information, and I soon found more details about Victor and Sophia. Victor seemed more like a bookish professor than a mogul, while Sophia's high-profile beauty made their relationship seem almost out of a movie. Despite my hours of searching, I was no closer to understanding how Clara fit into their lives. I began to focus on Victor's business interests. Some were publicly traded and easy to research, others were privately held and shrouded in secrecy. I wasn't a financial analyst, but even I could see that his ventures were vast and diverse. The more I learned, the less sense it made. Meanwhile, my day trading ventures were slowly improving. I had initially set aside $10,000 but lost most of it early on. Determined to turn things around, I invested another $20,000. After weeks of trial and error, I began to see modest gains. By the time I had poured nearly $40,000 into it, I was finally making consistent profits. It wasn't enough to replace my salary, but it felt good to have something I could control. 6 months after Clara left, I made a drastic decision: I quit my job. My boss and coworkers tried to talk me out of it, but I was resolute. My motivation for staying in sales had vanished along with Clara. Between day trading, my savings, and the equity in my mortgage-free house, I had nearly $2 million in assets. It wasn't an infinite cushion, but it gave me the breathing room I needed to focus on myself, my search, and figuring out what came next. I had $400,000 in my 401k I could tap into if necessary, giving me a solid financial safety net. Still, learning that Clara's lover was a billionaire, not a millionaire, shifted my perspective entirely. The odds of getting close to him seemed nearly impossible. Instead, I turned my focus to his wife, Sophia Lindgren. Unfortunately, there wasn't much information about her. Sophia was notoriously private, leading a reclusive life. There were even rumors of estrangement from her husband, which wasn't surprising given Victor Carter's wealth and apparent lifestyle. I discovered that Victor owned a massive estate in Tuxedo, New York, where Sophia and their children reportedly lived. Oddly, he rarely spent time there. Around the time I quit my job, I gathered this information and freed myself from obligations. With nothing tying me down, I felt ready to take my search to the next level. I packed light, a laptop, a few clothes, my camera, and a full tank of gas. I set out, ready to chase the truth. The only thing holding me back was concern for my daughters, Olivia and Ava. Olivia was married and living out of state, while Ava was finishing college and preparing for a master's program. Both had become pillars of strength for me, though their relationship with Clara's disappearance was fraught with pain. Ava, in particular, took her mother's abandonment to heart. At first, she blamed me, lashing out in frustration. But as weeks passed without a word from Clara, her anger turned toward her mother. When Ava began declaring that Clara was dead to her, I didn't stop her. In a twisted way, it felt good to see Clara lose the love of at least one of her daughters. Olivia soon followed suit, venting her own frustrations. By the time I tried to curb their negativity, it was too late. The damage had been done. I understood their pain. They felt as betrayed as I did. If this story seems disjointed, I apologize. My thoughts during that time were scattered, driven by the turmoil of divorce. It felt like a death, and I was cycling through the stages of grief. Denial hit first. I couldn't believe Clara was truly gone. Then came anger and bargaining, where I found myself praying at night, promising to go to church if she would just come back. Depression settled in during the third week and lingered for months. Acceptance was still out of reach. I told myself it would only come after a face-to-face meeting with Clara. At the start of the 7th month, several events shook me out of my inertia. First, my attorney called unexpectedly to ask about the divorce. I hadn't heard from him in months and had assumed everything was finalized since I hadn't signed anything. To my surprise, the case was still open. The next day, both Olivia and Ava called with startling news. They'd heard from their mother. Ava, already on edge, exploded when Clara called her. It took me 10 minutes just to calm her down enough to understand what had happened. When Ava realized it was her mother, she unleashed all her pent-up anger. She told Clara she was dead to her and wasn't welcome at her graduation or future wedding. Ava even went so far as to say Clara would never meet her grandchildren. Reportedly, Clara broke down, sobbing uncontrollably, before the call disconnected. Olivia's conversation with Clara started more calmly. She tried to understand where her mother had been and why she left, but Clara evaded her questions. Frustrated, Olivia brought up Victor Carter, revealing that she knew about the affair. Clara audibly gasped and tried to deny it, but Olivia had reached her limit. She accused Clara of ripping out my heart and abandoning her daughters for a man. Clara dissolved into tears, apologizing and insisting she still loved them before ending the call. Later that night, at around 3 a.m., my phone rang, jolting me awake. My heart raced, fearing something had happened to my daughters. Fumbling with the phone, I answered groggily. "Hello." A shaky voice on the other end replied, "Lucas. I'm so sorry. My 2 girls hate me." I recognized it as Clara but still asked, "Who is this?" The line went dead. The next day, I traced the call and found it had originated in Tuxedo, New York. It seemed Clara was back in the U.S. and possibly staying at Victor's estate. But that didn't make sense. Wasn't the estate supposed to be for his wife and kids? Maybe they were away, or perhaps Victor was visiting them now that he was back in the country. A month earlier, I had tried reaching out to Sophia Lindgren directly but got nowhere. Her staff politely informed me that she didn't take calls from strangers. I realized I was dealing with the ultra-wealthy and would need a different approach. That same day, I made some trades and netted $27,000, a small consolation, but a win nonetheless. That night, around 11 p.m., I went grocery shopping. As I returned to my car, a man grabbed me from behind and hissed, "You need to stop bothering Mr. Carter." My pent-up anger exploded. Drawing on my self-defense training, I twisted free, kicked him in the knee, and wrenched his wrist behind his back. "Who the hell are you?" I demanded, holding him in a position where I could easily break his arm. The man, probably in his 30s and in good shape, clearly wasn't some random thug. He had the demeanor of a professional. "You're making a big mistake," he growled through clenched teeth. Just then, I felt the cold steel of a weapon press against my head. A voice behind me commanded, "Let him go." I didn't panic. Keeping my voice steady, I said, "We're at a standoff. You can shoot me, but I'll still break your friend's arm. People will hear the gunshot, and they might catch you before you get away. Besides," I added, bluffing, "I have a hidden microphone. This entire conversation is being recorded, and if you pull that trigger, it'll tie Victor Carter to a violent assault." After a tense pause, the man with the gun asked, "What do you propose?" "Take 2 steps back and keep your weapon on me," I replied, trying to project calm despite the adrenaline surging through me. "I'll let your friend up, but he'll shield me. Your job was to warn me to stay away from Mr. Carter, and message received. After that, you'll leave. When I feel safe, I'll release your friend. He hesitated but then agreed. We were only supposed to warn you, not hurt you. Slowly, I lifted the man I had pinned. His face was a mask of rage, and he looked like he was ready to lunge at me. I can still put you down, I warned, locking eyes with him. But let's not go there. The man holding the gun started walking backward, glancing at me repeatedly as he moved away. When he was about 75 feet out, I released the man I'd been holding and gave him a shove toward his companion. He staggered but regained his balance quickly. Instead of leaving, he turned back to me and spat, "You've been warned. Stay away from Mr. Carter." I pulled out my concealed 9mm and aimed it at him. "Tell your boss I don't give a damn about him," I said coldly. "If he wants to keep his secrets, he'd better leave me alone." The man's face turned pale. He clearly hadn't expected me to be armed. For a brief moment, I considered following them to their car, but I realized it wouldn't help. There was no way their vehicle would be traceable to Victor Carter. I needed to regroup. I picked up my groceries, went home, and poured myself a stiff drink, trying to calm my nerves. Sitting at the kitchen table, I began listing everything I knew to piece together a new plan. It was clear now that Victor Carter was the man Clara had left me for. But why? His wife, Sophia, was stunning and, by all accounts, a kind woman. What could Clara possibly offer that Sophia couldn't? Was Sophia's perfection just a facade, or was there something deeper going on? The media hadn't hinted at any issues in their marriage, leaving me more confused than ever. It dawned on me that the threats might have been triggered by Olivia mentioning Victor's name to Clara, or perhaps by my call to Sophia. That connection had clearly rattled someone in Victor's circle. For a fleeting moment, I wondered if Clara's sudden departure and complete erasure of her old life might mean she was in witness protection. But the theory didn't hold water. If that were true, wouldn't she have taken the girls? Besides, the men I'd encountered in the parking lot were far too sloppy to be federal agents. They didn't operate like professionals, they operated like hired muscle. The confrontation raised two glaring questions: why did Victor Carter want me to stay away from Clara? And why had Clara left without even attempting to discuss her decision with me? My mind drifted to Clara's life before we were married. She had been 26 when we tied the knot and worked as a bookkeeper. She'd lived with her parents until their tragic death in a house fire, after which she moved into her own apartment. Much of her personal history had been lost in that fire. The more I thought about it, the more I realized how little I actually knew about her past. One detail that began to nag at me was her cell phone. Clara had always insisted on keeping a separate account, even though we could have saved money with a family plan. Her phone bill was sent directly to her, and I never saw any statements. It had seemed innocuous at the time, but in hindsight, it felt like a red flag I'd ignored. Around the time I learned about Victor Carter and the stalled divorce, I devised a plan to get copies of her phone records. I arranged a meeting with Clara's divorce lawyer under the pretense of discussing the final settlement. During the meeting, I reviewed all the paperwork laid out on the conference table. Discreetly, I snapped photos of the general power of attorney Clara had given her lawyer. Back home, I edited the document to make it look as though I had the authority. It wouldn't withstand close scrutiny, but I was confident it would work for my purposes. When I presented the altered document at the cell phone provider store, they asked for Clara's password. I remembered seeing her enter it once, a combination of our daughter's birth dates. Miraculously, it worked. I obtained the last year of her phone statements and learned that her account had been cancelled shortly after she left. Back home, I pored over the statements, categorizing most of the calls as routine. But one number caught my attention. Once a month, Clara had called a number in Nashville. The calls always occurred on the same day and at the same time. Then, in the months leading up to her departure, the frequency increased. The day before she left, she called that number 5 times. At first, I assumed this was her lover's number. But something didn't add up. If the affair had started recently, why had she been calling this number monthly for 8 months before she supposedly met Victor? The precision of the calls, always on the same day, was baffling. When I tried calling the number, it had been disconnected. My frustration boiled over. I had hoped the phone bills would provide clarity, but instead, they left me with more questions. After the parking lot confrontation, I knew I had to explore the one lead I'd been avoiding, the estate in Tuxedo, New York. I packed my car with essentials and made the 13-hour drive. My plan was vague, and the uncertainty gnawed at me. I debated whether to bring my weapon, knowing New York's strict gun laws didn't recognize my concealed carry permit. Ultimately, I left it hidden in my car, aware of the risks but unwilling to be completely unarmed. When I arrived in Tuxedo, I checked into a modest motel. The drive had been exhausting, but I couldn't sleep. My thoughts raced as I tried to formulate a plan. The next day, I would begin exploring the estate cautiously and with as much tact as I could muster. I wanted to pay cash for the motel, but the staff insisted on a credit card. After some negotiation, we compromised. They'd run my card but wouldn't process it unless necessary. I told them I was hiding from my wife until our divorce was finalized, and they seemed sympathetic. With that out of the way, I scouted Victor Carter's estate. It was sprawling, surrounded by high walls designed to keep prying eyes out. The front gate was guarded, though the men stationed there were discreetly positioned. Using my camera's telephoto lens, I snapped several pictures of each guard. My heart sank when I recognized one of them, the man I'd taken down in the parking lot. I was definitely in the right place. As I watched, 2 moving trucks pulled up to the gates. Panic surged. Were they preparing to leave? One of the guards spoke briefly with the drivers before the trucks turned around and left, but something told me they'd be back. I was desperate to get inside or at least glimpse what was happening. But I wasn't a secret agent with access to high-tech gadgets or insider resources. All I had was my determination, and that would have to be enough. Every idea I brainstormed sounded more ridiculous than the last. The estate covered an entire block, so I drove slowly around its perimeter, careful to avoid the front gate by taking side streets. On my third pass, I noticed a large tree near the northwest corner of the wall. 2 of its limbs extended over the barrier. It was a crazy idea, but I was running out of options. I stopped by a hardware store and bought a collapsible ladder and some rope. After returning to the estate, I parked my car a block away to avoid drawing attention and carried the ladder and rope to the tree. Checking to make sure the area was clear, I stashed the supplies in the bushes and returned after dark. Setting up the ladder against the tree, I climbed up with the rope slung over my shoulder. Once perched securely, I kicked the ladder down to minimize suspicion. 7 months ago, I wouldn't have been able to pull myself into that tree, but the fitness routine I'd taken up after Clara left had paid off. I climbed higher until I had a clear view of the backyard. The scene was almost serene. The yard was massive, meticulously landscaped, and outfitted with an array of luxurious amenities, a patio, an outdoor kitchen with an expensive grill, and an oval-shaped pool complete with a waterfall and slide. A woman reclined by the pool with a book in hand. Even from a distance, I recognized her as Sophia Lindgren. She was even more stunning in person. Then the sliding glass door opened, and a man stepped out. He lingered in the shade of the porch, making it hard to see him clearly. Finally, he walked over to Sophia and kissed her. My stomach dropped. It was Victor Carter. I was livid. This man had stolen my wife and was still with his own. The sheer arrogance of it all was nauseating. Before I could fully process the scene, chaos erupted inside the house. The sound of shouting drew my attention. 2 armed men, their weapons fitted with silencers, stormed out and ordered Victor and Sophia back inside. My heart raced. Whatever was happening wasn't just bad, it was catastrophic. I pulled out my phone and dialed emergency services. "There's been a shooting," I told the operator, my voice steady despite the fear coursing through me. I wasn't sure if anyone had been shot, but I figured it would get the police there faster. Quickly, I tied off my rope, threw it down, and slid to the ground. Without thinking, I sprinted toward the house, expecting gunfire at any moment. None came. Reaching the sliding glass door, I found it still open. I slipped inside quietly and followed the muffled voices to a spacious living room. Peeking inside, I saw 7 people. 4 of them were strangers, but the other 3 made my heart sink: Clara, Sophia, and Victor. Clara sat on the couch between Sophia and Victor. A short, heavy-set man stood in front of them, a cruel smile on his face as he aimed his weapon. "Please, Leo," Victor pleaded. "Let the women go. I'm the one who took the money. I can get it back, and more." Leo chuckled darkly. "It's not about the money anymore," he said. "It's about honor. You stole from us, and that woman," he pointed the gun at Clara, "got my brother Tony sent to prison for 20 years. I froze as Leo's words registered. "Leo, she didn't do it, I did," Sophia said, her voice steady despite the danger. "I used her computer to send all the information to the government. She had nothing to do with it." "All the information," Leo sneered. "It doesn't matter. She knows too much, and I'm not leaving any loose ends." Sophia opened her mouth to respond, but Victor interrupted. "Since you're going to kill us anyway, can I ask a few questions?" "Why not?" Leo replied with a smirk. "I've got time. I sent one of my men to confirm something." "What's that?" Victor asked. Leo's smile widened. "I was surprised when you and your bookkeeper showed up last night. We've been watching this place for weeks, figuring your wife would lead us to you. But you came back. There must be something here you wanted that she couldn't get." As if on cue, another man entered the room. "You were right, Leo," he said, grinning. "I found his safe, hidden in the floor." "I thought so," Leo said, turning back to Victor. "Your mistake was loving your wife too much. You should have trusted her with the combination. Not that it would have mattered. We would have followed her anyway, and she would have led us to you." Victor sighed, looking sadly at Sophia before addressing Leo. "Why go after Clara? She was just a bookkeeper." "Your personal bookkeeper," Leo corrected. "You treated her more like a daughter than an employee. I figured she knew where your money was and how to access it. I also thought she'd know every property you owned, giving us places to search." Sophia frowned. "How did you find out we informed on your brother?" Leo smirked. "It took years and a lot of money for our hackers to trace it back to you. I have to hand it to you, though, you were clever. Even your husband didn't know at first. And this whole Victor Carter identity was smart. Plastic surgery, new names, re-emerging as billionaires, it was brilliant. But not brilliant enough." His smile widened further. "Most of that wealth is just a facade, isn't it?" Leo sneered. "It was clever. I knew you didn't steal $1 billion. What was it, 40, 50 million? 78 million, Victor corrected, his voice steady despite the tension. Leo raised an eyebrow. "That much? Impressive. But you were always the smart one, Jacob. That's why my brother brought you in. You took our dirty money and turned it into legitimate businesses. But you got greedy, skimming too much and hiding it where we couldn't find it. Tony caught on, and he was going to deal with you, until your wife ratted him out to the feds." Victor's face darkened, but he said nothing. "I was thrown off for a while," Leo continued, pacing, "but eventually, I tracked down your bookkeeper. The plan was simple: grab her and her family, torture them one by one until she gave you up. But then she disappeared. That's when I knew there was a mole in my organization." Clara stiffened as Leo sneered. Didn't take long to figure out it was Chloe. We eliminated her. Chloe's dead? Victor asked, his voice cracking. She is, Leo said flatly. She tried to escape, jumped out of a second-story window. Died on impact. He shrugged. After that, it didn't make sense to grab her family without knowing where she was. So, we tapped their phones. Months later, we pieced together your real name and found this location. If you knew we were here, why didn't you take us last night? Victor asked. Leo chuckled. I outsmarted myself. I blocked your new IDs from being delivered, planning to replace the moving van drivers with my men. But when you sent the vans away, I realized you wouldn't wait long. So here we are. Leo's voice turned icy. Enough talk. I need the combination to the safe. Give it to me, or I'll start with the bookkeeper, then your wife, and finally you. Worst case, I'll cut the damn thing open. Listening from the shadows, everything clicked. My anger, fear, and confusion gave way to a grim determination. I knew I had one shot to stop this. Leo, Victor said, his voice hard. I used to think your brother was the worst person alive, but you've proved me wrong. Leo smirked. I'll pass your regards to Tony. Let's finish this. I took a deep breath, flipped the safety off my Ruger, and aimed at Leo. My firearms instructor's words echoed in my head, eliminate the most immediate threat first. Exhaling slowly, I squeezed the trigger. The shot hit Leo square in the back, sending him sprawling forward. Before anyone could react, I shifted my aim and fired at the man threatening Clara. He crumpled to the floor. My third shot hit another gunman, but then chaos erupted. Bullets flew as the remaining men returned fire. Pain tore through my side as a bullet slammed into me, but I kept firing, dropping a fourth man. Another shot struck my shoulder, and blood ran down my face from a grazing wound. When the last gunman fell, I swayed on my feet, struggling to stay upright. My vision blurred, and the room spun, but I locked eyes with Clara. She stared at me in shock, then rushed toward me as the sound of sirens wailed in the distance. I collapsed. When I woke, the hum of medical equipment surrounded me. My body ached all over, and I realized I was handcuffed to the bed. Pressing the call button, I braced myself for whatever was next. Clara entered with a police officer, her face pale and her eyes red and swollen. Lucas, she said, her voice trembling. Are you all right? It hurts, I mumbled. Need something for the pain. A nurse arrived and administered a shot of pain medication. Clara moved closer, tears streaming down her cheeks. Lucas, I'm so sorry, she sobbed. I didn't know what else to do. I was terrified of what Tony and Leo would do to you and the girls. I wanted to protect you. I stared at her, my emotions a tangled mess. You did this to protect us. She nodded, barely able to speak through her tears. Victor convinced me the only way to keep you safe was to make you think I'd left for someone else. I saw the hurt in your eyes that day, and it nearly broke me. Her words hit me hard. You hurt us so much, I said quietly. I spent months trying to understand why. I know, she whispered. It's my fault. I missed you and the girls so much that I called, even though Victor warned me not to. When I heard how much they hated me, I wanted to die. Her confession left me speechless. As the pain medication dulled my physical aches, I reached for her hand. You thought you were protecting us, I said. But Clara, we deserve to know the truth. She nodded, guilt etched into her face. Victor was working to get us new identities, but everything fell apart when the IDs didn't come. The moving trucks arrived, but we had nowhere to go. I was ready to die if it meant keeping you and the girls safe. I closed my eyes, the weight of her words settling over me. The next time I woke, sunlight streamed through the window. Clara was asleep in a chair beside me, her hands still holding mine. My arm throbbed, and my side ached, but I shifted uncomfortably, trying to adjust in the stiff hospital bed. The clink of the handcuff against the railing reminded me that I wasn't out of the woods yet. My attempt to sit up startled Clara awake. "Lucas," she said softly, wiping her eyes. I thought, her voice broke as she trailed off. "You thought what?" I asked, my voice hoarse. "That I'd lost you." Clara woke up abruptly, alarm filling her eyes. "What are you doing?" she asked. "Just trying to get comfortable," I replied with a weak smile. She adjusted my position until I felt more at ease, then surprised me with a kiss. I hadn't expected to feel her lips on mine again. "I love you with all my heart," she whispered. "Can you ever forgive me?" "Clara, it's clear I still love you," I said honestly. I thought about signing the divorce papers, but after 22 years of marriage, I couldn't do it without knowing why. "I suspected you might have taken a lover, but it never made sense. I couldn't give up until I was sure you didn't love me anymore." She burst into tears. "Oh God, what did I ever do to deserve you?" After she calmed down, I insisted she take the key to my motel room and get some rest. She looked utterly exhausted. Convincing the officer on duty to let her have the key was another hurdle, but a call to his superiors did the trick. Later, I learned the district attorney was debating whether to charge me for carrying an illegal weapon. It felt absurd. They were focused on a concealed carry permit when I had just helped take down a major crime syndicate. After Clara left, I asked the nurse for my cell phone, but the police had confiscated it. Eventually, they let me use the hospital phone, and I called Olivia and Ava to explain everything, leaving out the fact that I was in the hospital until the end. Both daughters were distraught, particularly over how they had treated their mother. I told them not to feel guilty. "I might have said worse if I'd had the chance," I admitted. Olivia caught a flight to LaGuardia and rented a car, arriving 10 hours later. She looked pale as she entered my room, just as Clara had stepped out for coffee. "Oh, Daddy, are you going to be all right?" she asked, hugging me gently. "The doctors say I'll be fine," I assured her. "They're discharging me tomorrow." The DA decided not to press charges as long as we remain available to testify. When Clara returned, I hadn't told her Olivia was coming, afraid she might flee again. They stared at each other for a tense moment before Olivia rushed to her mother. They hugged, crying and apologizing for hours. Later, Ava arrived, and the same scene repeated. Soon, all three women were clustered around my bed, fussing over me. When the nurse got me up to walk, Clara and the girls refused to leave my side. Tears welled in my eyes. After 7 months of chaos, my marriage and family were healing. In the weeks after the shootout, I learned Leo and 2 of his men had died at the scene, while the others survived and faced liquidation and hijacking charges. Leo's brother, Tony, was also indicted. Victor's guards had all been killed in the crossfire. Thankfully, the FBI kept Clara's and my names out of the media, and I obtained a court order to seal the records. Victor and Sophia turned state's evidence, exposing parts of the criminal network the feds hadn't uncovered. They surrendered much of their wealth, including the contents of the safe, and received community service. Afterward, they left the U.S., likely keeping some money hidden. A year later, we received a postcard from Spain that simply read, "We're sorry for everything. Thank you." Having Clara back home required adjustments for both of us. I still felt resentment about her leaving, even though I understood her reasons. She struggled with night terrors, often waking up screaming. Counseling helped us both. Coming home was also a shock for her. The house had changed while she was gone. I had completed all the repairs, repainted, and redone our bedroom entirely. Clara also had to adapt to my new work life. I no longer wanted a traditional job and worked from home, day trading. It gave us the freedom to take spontaneous vacations, something she loved. She was impressed by my fitness transformation and started going to the gym with me, though karate didn't interest her. Now, we go to the gym 3 times a week, and I practice karate twice a week. Our relationship reignited with a new intensity. After everything we'd been through, we didn't take each other for granted anymore. Ava is getting married in 3 months, and Clara has thrown herself into wedding planning. Olivia is expecting a baby boy, and both daughters call us almost daily. Ava even moved in for a few weeks after I got out of the hospital, but I was relieved when she returned to her apartment. I didn't need another wife, I joked to Clara. Clara and I still worry about each other. For months, we'd wake up in the night, reaching out to make sure the other was still there. It's a small price to pay for everything we've regained. At the start of all this, I was desperate to understand why Clara had left me. Now, after everything, I finally have my answer, and my family back.